All right, it's time to jump in and get our feet wet and start getting the basic foundations of programming under our belt. So as we've done before, I'm in my search window. I'm going to make sure I type in the word idle, I-D-L-E, making sure I have Python 3 point something, so mine is 3.6, yours might vary, but as long as it's Python 3, we're in good shape. And we did this last week. We remember that this was our interpretive shell. We're in the shell. This allows us to just type in one command. So I can type in print hello, and it does that, but I can't do lines of code. I can only do one line at a time. Not very useful unless I just want to test out some lines and see if it works. So I'm going to choose File, New File, and save this file so I have it ready to go. Save it as, I'm going to put it in my desktop. We're in chapter 1. I'll call this one variables because that is what we're going to end up talking about. Variables.py. All right, so let's kind of do what we did before. Let's see, we are going to always comment some code. So I'm going to write learning about variables. Okay, and some of the fundamentals of programming. Let me just write these words out. And then we're going to look at this a little bit more in detail. Input, processing, and output. So when we think about what a program does when we write software, a program takes some kind of input, maybe something from the keyboard, from your user. It processes that input, and then it puts something back up on the screen, or maybe on a printer or something. So these are the basic fundamentals of writing a program. We want to think about what is our input, how do we process that input, and then what will our output, what will our result be. So these, remember, are comments. In other words, I've used this hashtag just to give some human readable information about the code. The program itself is not going to read it at all. This is just for the human who might be grading my paper, or more likely, if I'm working in a programming shop, someone else who will take on my code and need to change and edit or what have you. So far we have just done a print statement, which is an output. We're printing out something to our console, and we've done hello world. Okay, and so then if I run that, sure enough, in my output is hello world. Well, okay, maybe I want to make it a little bit more personal. My name is Kirsten, so now I'm going to output Kirsten, and that works great. And then maybe instead JD is going to be running it, so I'm going to do run JD. Well, that's great and all, but it really doesn't make sense because this isn't very flexible, is it? If I want to write this code, and I wanted to write it for different people, how on earth I need to find a way to be able to change this JD or the person's name. So this is what we call hard coding it, where we just put in something to print. This is exactly what we're going to want to print, but it doesn't vary in any way. There's no room for variance here. So the next thing I want to do is introduce you to the concept of variables, and we're going to do that next. All right, so let's talk about what a variable is. A variable is a name that we give to a location in memory that we set aside that will store information that could potentially change. So again, we use that storage location to store values. It's a single value that can change throughout our program. If you're comfortable with math and with algebra, remember that we would have letters like X or Y, and that number could vary. It could be different types of numbers depending on the situation in the sentence. So let's look at something that has a little bit more meaning. Let me see if I can give you some examples. When we think of the word variable, what we're talking about is a bucket. I use the bucket as a image, but it's a place in memory that is set aside at the beginning of our code when our program runs. And we call it something. In other words, I've called this bucket item ordered. This bucket represents a storage location in memory, and instead of knowing that memory's address, all I have to do to refer to this bucket is call this bucket or the storage memory item ordered. This is a variable name. This is a name I've given this bucket. not unlike giving your dog a name when you want to refer to your dog. It's kind of the same thing. But anyway, we give our storage location a name, and we call this a variable name. Okay, let's continue on. So at the beginning of your program, your computer wants to get some input. It needs to know what it needs to do. What is it that I need? What's our purpose here? So the computer is going to give some kind of prompt to the user. What can I get you? In this case, we have a dog who is wanting to place an order for a bone, it looks like. And so once the computer asks the dog, what is it that you would like? The dog types in, I would like the bone, and sends that back to the computer via the enter key. And so what happens to that bone, to that value, is it gets put into this bucket, into this storage location in memory that we've called item ordered. So anytime I refer to item ordered in my code, it's actually looking inside the bucket to see what's in there. In other words, this is the processing. So the computer then now has a value that's put into memory, and its next job is to process that information. And so in this case, this computer is trying to calculate the tax on the item that was ordered, which in this case, he looks in the bucket and he sees that's a bone, so that's going to calculate a certain tax rate. And then he calculates the total. So once the processing is done, we need to return something, output, back to our user. In this case, the computer has processed that item ordered. He looks inside the bucket, he sees it's a bone, and so that output is put to the computer. He says, your dog bone, and here's the total that was calculated, $4.99. So all is well. We had input. We put that input into our variable bucket or our storage in memory. The computer processed it, and then output whatever needed to be processed and output depending on what the solution was, depending on what the problem was. I also want to take this another step further and give you this idea. Let's say this input, we don't have to do just one input, process, output cycle. Let's say the input, process, output cycle runs again. The computer asks the dog, what else can I get you? Well, this time the dog wants to order a steak. So when the dog presses the keys for steak, that steak then goes into the item ordered bucket. But now notice what happened to the bone. The bone went away. In other words, this variable, this storage location, will only hold one value. So now if we put a new value in the bucket, the old value disappears, and now every time we look in the item ordered bucket, we get the new item, which is the steak. So when we refer to that variable, we're referring to the new value, steak. So a different tax amount is going to be calculated because most likely the steak is more expensive, so the tax rate's higher. And then as we process the order, this should say output, not processing. I think I have a problem here, but this should be our output. And output is putting out to the monitor the steak and the newly calculated price. So the takeaway here that's important for us to get the concept of is that we have variable names that refer to a space in memory that we can put values in so that we can hold different values either one time during our code, or maybe we want to put different values into that bucket throughout our code. And we'll see examples of that, and you'll get very much more comfortable with that as we move along. So let's go back to our original program and see how we're going to use a variable. All right, so we're back to our original Hello World, Hello Kirsten, Hello JD program, and we're going to utilize variables to see how we can make this work a little bit better. So I'm going to hit an enter just so I can, there we go, start a new line just to clear some lines up for me. And this time what I'm going to do is I'm going to utilize a variable name, and I'm going to call that variable name username. Now, it's very important when you're creating username or variable names that you create variable names that have some kind of meaning. For example, if you read this word username, you can intuitively figure out that there's probably a user's name that's going to be put into this variable. If I put y, I don't know what that's supposed to be. What kind of value is y supposed to hold? I know, algebra, right? But I'm going to put username because I'm going to allow a space in memory that I can hold the username that's entered from the keyboard. Also notice the way I wrote this. First of all, there's certain rules you have to know about creating a variable name. You can never put a variable name with a space. So a variable name always has to be one word. But sometimes you want to utilize two words. So what we do is use a format called camel case. This is very common among programmers. And what I've done is the first letter is lowercase, but when I get to the second word, I capitalize the first letter of the second word. That's for readability. This makes it pretty easy to read. If I'm not allowed a space, then at least username is easy to discern the difference between the word user and name because N is capitalized. We call this kind of capitalization camel case because I guess that's supposed to be like a camel's hump in the middle. Sometimes you might see it capitalized at the beginning, but I think it's good practice for especially your future classes that you'll be taking to get into the habit of creating the first word of the variable name with a lowercase. Now you could certainly have just all one word. Name certainly makes sense, and that's how I would write the word name. But in this case, I'm just being a little bit more specific, and I'm saying username. Okay, so again, the main thing is that you want to make sure that this is readable. So someone reading your code could jump in and know intuitively, based on the way you named it, what type of data is being put, what values are you putting into that variable. The next thing I'm going to do is put an equal sign. Now to you and I, this is an equal sign, but in programming language right now, we're going to call this an assignment. In other words, we always put our variable names on the left-hand side of our statement, and this says assign, or whatever's on the right-hand side goes into this variable name. So the variable is always on the left. The equal means assign, and then what value do I want to put into? Let me just type first. What do I want to put into? What values? What am I putting in? Well, I'm putting in people's names. I want them to type something at the keyboard, and then whatever they type in, I'm going to put into this bucket or this variable name or this location in memory called username. Now, in order to do that in Python, this word input with the parentheses, oh, I don't need the semicolon, I apologize. Input with the parentheses is telling the computer to wait for, just pause, and put that little flashing cursor and wait for the user to put in a value. In our case, we know that the user is putting in a string. A string is a collection of characters. This is like writing a sentence. It's not numbers, it's letters and characters. A collection of letters and characters, and we call that a string. So I wasn't prepared to tell you about a string, but it came out of my mouth, so I had to get started on it. You're going to get it in the next video anyway, so it doesn't hurt to get introduced to it. And so now what I'm going to do is, instead of putting in hello JD, what I'll do is I'll put in the user name. Okay? And so what I'm in essence doing here is whatever's in that bucket, put that in username. So whatever the user puts in goes into the variable, and then when it comes to print, the computer needs to look into that location memory and whatever values in that bucket or in that storage location is what needs to print. So let's run that and see what we get. Okay, I get this cursor flashing and nothing else is happening, so I think that's where I'm supposed to put something in, so I'm going to put my name and see what happens. And sure enough, that's what gets output. So notice the difference in coloring too. The shell is trying to give us an indication that this is the user input, and then this was what was output from the program that I wrote. Okay, well, we're getting there. First of all, I don't know about you, but if I didn't know about the program, let's see. Well, it's exactly. If I didn't know about the program, how do I know where am I don't see that I'm supposed to put something in. So if I start typing, I don't know where that works. So in other words, let's do this. In our input statement, I'm going to give a clue or a prompt or something to my user to get into my head so they know what I was expecting them to do at the keyboard. So now I'm going to say, enter your name. Okay, that should give my user some kind of information, some kind of clue as to what I'm expecting at this blank flashing cursor. So let's try that. And sure enough, that makes more sense, right? Enter your name. Now I know I'm supposed to put in something, and now something gets returned. So this is getting a little bit better. Notice that the output was not smart enough, even though you and I know you're supposed to put a space. So the output wasn't smart enough to put a space between the code that I wrote in my program and the input I put in at the keyboard. So if I want to be a little bit cleaner, I might put a colon or something and then a space. So what we're starting to see now is that everything in these quotations literally is what's going to be printed out. The program's not going to try and figure something out for me. I have to be very, very specific, including spaces. So now let's run that and let's see if that looks a little bit cleaner. Sure enough, now there's a space, and if I write my name, things are getting a little bit better. But I'm going to do one better. I would like to, instead of having it print out just my name, let's say hello and Kirsten. So to do that, I'm going to come into this print statement and just type something in here, and then I will hello, and then I'm going to put a space and a quote, a space, and the plus sign. Okay, now I'm very specific here on quotes, and let me explain this statement going on right here. Anything you have in quotation marks is literally what's going to be printed to the screen. So because the word hello is in quotation marks, that's what's going to print out on the screen. This plus sign in this case means join these two ideas together. Username, as you know now, is a variable that has a value in it. So this syntax, this plus sign, is suggesting get the value that's in username, which I put in as Kirsten or whatever was put in at the keyboard, and join that with this literally what's in the strings, in the quotes. This is a string. I apologize for saying that again. This is a string because a string is a collection of characters or numbers that we put into quotation marks. And that's something that we're telling the computer, this is exactly what I want you to put in. Don't try and look into some space in memory. Put exactly what I'm putting in these quotation marks. Username does not have quotes around it, so that means it's going to put in the value that it finds in the variable name. So let's run that and see. So if I type in, let's put something different now. Let's put in Indy. And if I hit enter, you'll see exactly that happen. Here's the part that was printed literally. That's the string or the collection of characters that I put within this quotation marks. It also included the space that I was very careful to leave in my quotation marks. That's what put the space between the word hello and Indy. And then it joined. We also call this word concatenate. Concatenate is a fancy word that says join the strings together. And it looked into this bucket of username, and in it, it found the value that I had typed in at the keyboard, and that's what was printed out. Just to bring my point home, if I put the word username, which we're using as a variable, do you think that's going to work? What is that going to print out? Is that going to print out the value that's in the variable username, or is that going to literally print out username? Let's run it and see. So if I type in a name, let's do a different name this time. How about Michael? So this time, oh, how come it didn't print out the word Michael? It printed out the name of my variable. That's because this is in quotations. So quotations, again, is what we call a string. A string is literally a collection of characters or numbers or keyboard symbols or whatever you can type on the keyboard that I literally want that printed to the screen. If instead I want you to replace, I want the printout to be what value is in that variable name, then we don't put it in quotes. So it's very important to remember the difference between the two. So now if I run it, I could put in a name. I've got a nice prompt. Who can I put next? I'll put Callie, and then hello Callie. So I'm introducing you in this video to this concept of variables, and we'll see more and more variables as we go along and why they're useful, besides the fact that we can use it right here to input a name. Let's just take this one step further. Not necessarily the best code, but it's a good example. So I'm going to create a variable called the sentence. And here again, you can see my camel casing. I have 2 words to give you a variable name, and you're already getting the idea that there's going to be a sentence put into that variable, so you'll have some kind of a clue. What I think I'm going to do is I'm going to make this concatenation, this join. I'm going to put that here. Remember that variables are always on the left. The equal sign means assign whatever's on the right and put that into the variable that's on the left. Put all of this that's on the right into that location in memory. In this case, I want to join a string, which is hello and space. I'm joining it because of the concatenation with the value that's in that variable and put the join of those 2 into the sentence. So by the time I'm completed with this statement, this variable will hold this sentence, hello Fred, or hello monkey, or whatever name was put into username. And then can you guess what we're going to put in this print? If I just put in the sentence, which is a variable name that refers to whatever value was put into this place in memory that I'm calling the sentence, it'll in essence do the same thing that we've done here. And in fact, let's see, I have to think of a new name. Missy. So an output looks exactly the same, but the difference is I just gave you an example of another use of utilizing a variable. So you could do it either way. Either way would have worked. But we definitely see the pattern of, or the benefit of using variables. So we'll keep adding on to ideas of variables. This is a good start. And let's start talking in the next video about different types of variables.